of the chapter, I reminded us that in the background of this story, as it were, there is a ticking time bomb that's still primed to go off. And even though Haman is dealt with, there's still this issue of this edict that has been sent out by the king that is essentially genocide for the entire Jewish population. And there's still this question hanging in the air of what we do about this. How is this going to be addressed? And as I was thinking about that and coming into chapter 8, I just wanted to let's start off. We don't do this very often. Let's start off with interactive time. Raise your hand if you like stories. Okay. If your hand is down, you're a liar, because we all love stories, right? Now, I didn't specify that it had to be a story that you read. We go to movies to see stories. We go to plays to see stories. We sit around together as a family and tell stories to one another. How was your day? Well, this happened and this happened and this happened. We're inherently storytelling people, right? There's something about stories that grips us. It's part of our humanity. Throughout all cultures, there have always been stories. From the most primitive culture to the most advanced culture. Now, the way that we tell those stories might be a little bit different, but there's always stories. We are a storytelling, story-loving people. And the reason for that is because God is a storytelling God. And this storytelling God has woven that characteristic into us as beings created in his image. And normally, in a good story, that there's this kind of there's certain characteristics or certain qualities. So there's normally a hero, a villain, and some kind of dilemma or danger to overcome. So for example, if you take the Avengers and you have heroes, plural, you have one main villain, Thanos, and you have this danger or dilemma that has to be overcome, which is half of the world's population being wiped out when he gets the final Infinity Stone, puts it in his gauntlet, and snaps his finger, right? And then when that story is over, you have a follow-up story of how do we undo this? How do we right the wrong that has been done? So there's still this dilemma to overcome. And in addition, there's kind of a story arc that all good stories have. There's a setup, there's the plot as it unfolds, there's uncertainty and dilemma, and tension builds to the point of climax where everything is on the line, and then it comes to this sort of resolution. And this story arc can take different forms. For example, in Macbeth, things start out bad, they get better, and then they end really bad. If you are a fan of The Lion King, things start really good with Simba in the Pride, and then they get bad when Mufasa is killed by Scar, and then Simba is exiled, and then they kind of get good again when he meets Timon and Pumbaa and discovers Hakuna Matata and lives in his little African paradise, and then they sort of peak, and Nala finds him, and he finds out that Scar's in control of his kingdom and everything's bad and there's no food, and it kind of goes downhill until there's this epic fight with Scar, and Scar is killed, and then it comes back up, right? When Nala and him are, I guess, dedicating, whatever, their new little lion cub. So there's a different arc to that story. In The Lord of the Rings, things start out really good in the Shire. And I'm putting all my nerd cards on the table today. Things start really good in the Shire, and then they get progressively worse until the ring is destroyed. Sorry if you haven't read it. And then things get back to good. So it can take different forms, but there's all these basic elements in a good story. And there can be stories within a larger story that have their own arcs that contribute to the complexity and enjoyment of the overall story arc, right? If you've read Tom Clancy, for example, you have different storylines that are going on, and each of them has their own kind of story arc, and it's all contributing to the bigger picture of the larger, grander story that he's telling. And I say all of that because the Bible is the same way. The Bible has a story arc where things start off good, and then they go downhill because of a dilemma, and there's uncertainty and tension builds throughout the entire Old Testament until we get to the climax of the cross. And then things get better until ultimately there will be a resolution when Christ returns and we know the outcome, right? In this story, there's one main hero and one main villain. There's one massive problem of sin, but the story also includes smaller stories, little storylines within the larger story that contribute to it. And in these little storylines, there's still the same story arc, and behind each of these minor heroes is the main hero, and behind each of these lesser villains is the main villain. And behind each of these dilemmas or problems that need to be overcome and resolved is the larger problem of sin that is undergirding it and driving it. And all of these smaller stories contribute to the grand story arc of God's redemptive history. So today what we're going to see, that was important, by the way. That was not just some sort of random nerd diatribe. That we'll come back to that in a minute. But what we're going to see today is the climax of the story of Esther, and then what follows in the last chapters of the book is the resolution. And so the first thing we see in Esther chapter 8, verses 1 to 2, is that Esther comes clean. And that same day, so Haman has been killed. Remember, this is all in the space of like 24 hours. Haman came up with a plot to kill Mordecai, erected a pole, went to the king. The king couldn't sleep, realized that he had overlooked honoring Mordecai, and Haman just so happens to come in to his court at that point, asked him what he should do to honor the one that the king wishes to honor. Haman, thinking it's him, puts on the big parade with the king's horse and everything. And the king says, okay, go do that for Mordecai. So Haman has to lead Mordecai around on a horse, shouting, this is what the king does to the one he wants to honor. He goes home dejected, but then the eunuchs come and grab him because there's a second feast that he has to go to, a second private feast with Esther and the king. And so he goes there, and the king, at that feast, the plot is revealed where Esther's like, hey, this guy wants to kill me and my people. And this is a very broad paraphrase. Wants to kill me and my people. The king gets mad, makes some pretense for killing Haman, as if like he was assaulting the queen or something like that, even though he probably wasn't. And Haman is killed. And then chapter 8 starts. On the same day, King Xerxes gave the property of Haman to the enemy of the Jews, to Queen Esther. Then Mordecai was brought before the king, for Esther had told the king how they were related. The king took off his signet ring, which he had taken back from Haman, and gave it to Mordecai. And Esther appointed Mordecai to be in charge of Haman's property. So two things happen in these two verses. First of all, Esther, who has been concealing her Jewish heritage, has revealed that to the king already. And now she reveals that Mordecai is really her adopted father and part of her family. So for over 5 years or so, she has been hiding this fact at Mordecai's behest or at his advice. And she tells the king that she is a Jew and Haman hatched a plot against her people and against her. And now she finally fully comes clean and discloses her relationship to Mordecai. And this is important because this is the reason that Mordecai is able to approach the king. Do you remember when the plot was discovered? Part of the problem was that Mordecai did not have access to the king. He couldn't go to the king directly. He had to work through Esther, and even Esther didn't technically, legally have access to the king like that. So what's happened is, in this plot being revealed, and in Esther revealing that Mordecai is actually related to him, the king's starting to put two and two together, and he's like, wait a minute, this guy saved my life, was the adopted father of my wife, and so bring him here. Bring him here. And the reason that he's able to come into the presence of the king is because of his relationship, at least in part, to Esther. And then the second thing that happens is Esther is given all of Haman's estate, as it were. And so all of the wealth that he bragged on, all of the wealth that he hoped in, went to Esther. I love this book. It's a book of ironies. Remember a couple chapters ago how he was bragging to his family and friends about all of his wealth? Well, now all of his wealth is in the hands of the Jewish queen that he was unknowingly plotting against. So a convicted criminal had no right to property, and their property was taken by the crown when they were executed, and it was at the disposal of the crown. And so the king decides, well, I'll just give this to the queen. And so Esther comes into some wealth, and Mordecai comes into position and power. And Esther then entrusts Mordecai with her estate. So remember last week we noted how 24 hours can change your life, right? Haman went from top of the world to top of a pole, spiked, dead in 24 hours. Well, what I want you to notice is that there's also a big difference in the life of Mordecai and Esther in 24 hours. Remember 24 hours ago, they were really concerned about their Jewish identity being exposed. They were really concerned about approaching the king. They were really concerned throughout the entire story so far. I mean, Mordecai has gone to great lengths to conceal Esther's Jewishness. It's almost like he's like, if the king finds out that you're really Jewish, these things are not going to go well for us. And now, all the things that they were concerned about, approaching the king, their ethnic heritage, not being in a position to help their people, are totally reversed overnight. Now, I would just pause here because I wonder how many of us make these fictional problems in our head when we're thinking about something, and we create monsters that aren't really there out of what might happen, what could potentially happen. And we get ourselves all worked up over something that in the end proves to kind of not be such a big deal as we made it out to be, right? All of their fears were really unfounded. What we've discovered as we've gone through this is that Esther, or that the king is not really so much anti-Jewish. He's not like an anti-Jewish king. He's just kind of a bumbling idiot that's willing to take really bad advice. He's just concerned with himself. And so in the same day, notice verse 1, on that same day, all of the things they were concerned about are found to be not really that big of a deal. A few days ago, Mordecai was outside tearing his clothes and mourning at the gate. And overnight, Mordecai has a parade, is recognized, Haman is killed. He has taken over the position that Haman once had. This is a book of reversals. And they're stunning. The circumstances of Mordecai were radically altered. Where Esther and Mordecai were not in a position to be able to help their people, as we'll see in a moment now, they are in a position to help their people. And just as the proud and sinful can go from on top of the world to utter ruin and destruction overnight, we also need to understand that those who are mourning and worrying and lamenting can go to the top of the world overnight. I think that's an important thing for us to maybe contemplate for a moment. When you're in a dark place, when you are overcome by grief, when things aren't going right, even when you're doing right, we need to remind ourselves of Mordecai. Seasons change, right? For everything, there's a time and a season and a purpose under heaven. There's a time to laugh and a time to mourn. There's seasons in life. There's arcs, as it were, to our story. There are low points, there are high points. But what Christians need to remember is that seasons change. Now, sometimes they change quickly, as in the case of Mordecai and Esther. Sometimes they change really slowly, but they change. When you feel that all you have are tears, remember that you're going to laugh again. That's probably a really good thing to remind yourself of in that moment. Because what we tend to do is we tend to isolate ourselves in our grief or in our sorrow and think that this is going to last forever. But it won't. We'll laugh again. There will be a reason to smile. There will be joy in our lives. When some situations seem to be crushing you, you need to remember that you're going to pass through it, that you'll get to the other side of it. And that fact is helpful. Let's not detract from that, but we also need to remember that it should be aimed not at some kind of self-soothing tactic or denial of reality, but it should be aimed at us seeing and loving and trusting the one that holds our lives and situations in his hands and who loves us. The fact that it will pass and that you will smile, that you will laugh, that the pain will subside is undergirded by the reality that God sustains us and sees us through our afflictions, that he comforts us and carries us, as it were, in the midst of difficulty. So the strength to mourn in a way that's different from those who mourn without any hope, the strength to keep walking through the valley of the shadow of death and not fearing evil, comes from the fact that God is with us, that he sustains us. His rod and his staff comfort us. Isn't it interesting that the psalmist in Psalm 23, he has this optimistic, mournful quality to him. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I'm not going to fear any evil because you're with me. I'm not walking through this alone. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. And on the other side of that is a table prepared for me in the place of, in the place of my enemies. I know I'll make it through the valley. So God has plans for us in the furnace of sorrow and affliction, and we come to know him and trust him more than if our life were easy and everything went our way. I heard it put this way. What would it be like if your life was just a tepid 68 degrees all the time? It would be miserable. We tend to think of it as if that would be great, but the only reason that we enjoy spring and fall 68-degree days is because we weather that 110-degree heat index of summer, and then this year, negative 40-degree index of winter. You don't want a tepid life. You want to learn through the difficulties and sorrows so that you can appreciate coming through them and appreciate the joys that come through on the other side. Because in all of that, God is forging in Christians Christ-like character. And one day, the situation that you're going through will pass. So we need to learn to live in the moment, as it were, right? We need to learn to rejoice at the high points, and we need to learn to mourn at the low points, but do so in a way that recognizes that both of those are not lasting in this life. They will come and they will go. The seasons of difficulty will be replaced by new seasons of joy, and relief will come. Look at how the psalmist says it in Psalm 30, verses 11 to 12. You have turned for me my mourning into dancing. You have loosed my sackcloth and covered me with gladness, that my glory may sing your praise and not be silent. O Lord my God, I will give thanks to you forever. We need to learn to live in seasons and not assume that that season will last forever. And the point is that things change, circumstances change. We need to learn to see worship as a necessary truth and reality in every circumstance. And we need to remember two things, specifically when things aren't going our way. Number one, that God is for us and in control. And second, that God is with us in our season of difficulty and sorrow, so that we can lean on him to see us through. And we need to remember in good and sweet seasons of life that we are experiencing a foretaste of eternity. It's an appetizer. And the main course comes at the marriage supper of the Lamb. And it won't last forever in this life. So learn to rejoice in the good times. Learn to lament in the sad times. But both of those have to have a Godward flavor to them for them to truly be what God has designed for them to be in our lives. So, Esther now has a request and a problem in verses 3 to 8. So things are looking pretty good, except for this looming problem of the edict. Haman has been dealt with. He's dead. Mordecai has advanced and taken his place as the king's chief advisor. And yet the edict of the king is still in place, and the fate of the Jewish people is still in peril. The big issue is unresolved. So Esther again approaches the king. Look at verse 3. Then Esther went again before the king, falling on at his feet and begging him with tears to stop the evil plot devised by Haman the Agagite against the Jews. Again the king held out his golden scepter to Esther. So she rose and stood before him. And Esther said, if it please the king, and if I have found favor with him, and if he thinks it right, and if I am pleasing to him, let there be a decree that reverses the orders of Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, who ordered that the Jews throughout the king's provinces should be destroyed. For how can I endure to see my people and my family slaughtered and destroyed? A couple things to notice about Esther in this exchange. First of all, she's proactive. Mordecai is not recorded as talking to her about, hey, you need to go talk to the king again. She's taking initiative, risking her own life a second time. She is no longer the passive Esther we saw in the earlier chapter. She's courageous yet calculated. She's bold yet humble. She's confident yet defers to the king. Second of all, she's authentic. Look at how she does this. She doesn't try to go with a mask on as if like I need to hide my emotions from the king. She goes with tears. There is a sense in which her appeal is magnified by the fact that she's willing to express her sorrow and fear at the impending action that's going to take place. She doesn't conceal her concern for God's people and the peril they find themselves in. She's honest about her concerns. She is genuine in her concern for her people. Now, if she was only concerned for herself and Mordecai, this would probably be a little bit different. She might be okay. I mean, they've both been elevated. I doubt very much that the king either forgot about the edict or intended for Mordecai to be the chief advisor for 10 months until the edict went out and then have him killed along with everybody else. He's already demonstrated his willingness to care for and protect Esther, his queen. So Esther has a genuine and authentic concern for her people that comes out as she's talking to the king. No pretense here. No self-interest. Just authentic concern for her people. Notice also that she is direct. She doesn't mince words. She doesn't hint. She doesn't have 3 feasts. She doesn't have 2 feasts. She doesn't ask him to 1 feast. She goes right up to him, directly asking him. She doesn't hint. She's open and clearly asks what she is after and explains why it's important to her. So before she masterfully got the king to say that he would give her what she wanted 3 times before revealing it this time, she's direct and doesn't beat around the bush. I think that Esther right here is exemplifying what I call fierce femininity. There's a feminine quality to the way that she's doing this, and yet she's fierce and courageous in it. Femininity is not opposed to courageous boldness, right? We kind of tend to pit those two against one another. Strong, courageous, and yet feminine. Those two go together. That's what God designed women to be. God designed them to be a helper that's fit for a husband. A helper that's fit for a husband will tell the husband what she thinks, will approach the husband in an authentic manner and share her concerns. She will be direct. She will be proactive, but all of it is aimed at this, with this feminine quality of helping, supporting, undergirding, improving, blessing. The woman in Proverbs 31 is fierce femininity. She is industrious. She is strong. She is courageous. She is totally untenable. So if you're like a woman and you're reading that and you're discouraged, like, don't worry, it's okay. She's supposed to be that way. She's somebody that we should aspire to, right? She's somebody that women should aspire to. Fierce femininity. But there's a significant problem to overcome. Look at Verse 7, King Xerxes said to Queen Esther and Mordecai the Jew, I have given Esther the property of Haman, and he has been impaled on a pole because he tried to destroy the Jews. Now go ahead and send a message to the Jews in the king's name, telling them whatever you want, and seal it with the king's signet ring. But remember that whatever has already been written in the king's name and sealed with the king's signet ring can never be revoked. So we've got a problem now. The problem is related to the same problem the king had in the last chapter, and that is that the king's edicts are final. When the king says it, it's law, and no takebacks, right? Can't undo this. And if he revokes them, it weakens his position. Remember, this is the culture where the king is the ultimate authority and viewed as a god. That means if he reneged on this edict or changed his mind, he would appear weak, indecisive, and his authority would be weakened. And I think it's worth noting here that, again, we see an example of how God is not like King Xerxes. Right? God's edicts are final. God's will is decisive. God does make decrees. And those decrees are unchanging. But unlike King Xerxes, he never gets caught in a moment where he's like, oh man, I wish I could go back on that one. Now I got to come up with some new thing to do to try to worm my way around this. No, God is an all-wise, all-knowing, all-powerful God, and therefore his decrees are not only standing and final and set in eternity, but they are good and for his glory and for our joy. God is not like King Xerxes. So basically the king says, I've done my part. I took care of Haman. Do what you want. You have the signet ring. It carries my authority. I'm giving you the authority to deal with it, but there's just one catch. You can't undo the edict that Haman did. You just can't undo it. Go do whatever you want. You remember the last time the king sort of delegated this type of authority to somebody? It was Haman, and the first edict came out. It's like he doesn't learn from his mistakes. Like, why in the world would you just hand over that type of authority to somebody without any sort of check or balance or anything like that? He's just, whatever, I'm just going to go drink wine over in the corner and party and look at all my treasures or whatever. You guys handle this. I don't want to be bothered with this. Apparently, he's just not too concerned with his kingdom. So Esther and Mordecai now have to figure this out. How do you save the Jews from an edict that says there will be a day when it is open season on them, and if you kill one of them, you get their property, all the while not being able to veto that? That brings us to Esther and Mordecai's solution. So homework for you, go back to chapter 3 this week and compare verses 12 to 15, which is the original edict that Haman came up with chapter 8, verses 9 to 14, which is the second edict that Mordecai and Esther came up with. And the narrator masterfully weaves these two accounts together by relating the language of Edict 1 and in Edict 2. And I'll just give you a start. Look at verse 11. In verse 11, the king's decree gave the Jews authority in every city to unite to defend their lives. They were allowed to kill, slaughter, and annihilate anyone of any nationality or province who might attack them or their children or their wives and take the property of their enemies. Does that sound familiar? It's like the exact same wording of the first edict. Anyone who attacks them, and the Jews are able to bind together and defend themselves. And what this does is this basically fits in the Old Testament principle of an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. So notice a couple things. First of all, this isn't about retribution. This isn't about, all right, you guys came up with an edict. We're going to come up with a bigger edict. It's open season on the Persians one day before. They're not going to come up with an edict that says, all right, all Persians have to surrender their arms and over to the Jews a day before and then the Jews can go just open season. It doesn't say, all right, Jews, you can go ahead and you can go into any house you want and you can take whatever you want from the Persians. This is about making sure that the punishment fits the crime and that the damage done by the crime doesn't go, or the damage done by the punishment doesn't go beyond the damage done by the crime. So for an eye in the Old Testament is actually a protection against retribution that exceeds the original offense. This prevents somebody from killing one of my cows and me retaliating by slaughtering their whole herd, right? You see this in like Middle Eastern culture now. Like one of the reasons that Afghanistan is never going to be stable is because it's a tribal culture where there are like centuries old vendettas between families. I mean, it's Hatfield and McCoys all over the place there, just battling it out. And they'll join together to battle against somebody else. But as soon as that battle's won, it's back to the original thing. And we're going to fight and kill one another and take one another's land. This prevents that. Notice the wording. It's, this is not open season on all non-Jews. So this is not about retribution. Secondly, this is about the right of self-defense. And there's something inherent in here. There's all sorts of political theory things in here that we could pull out about rights of property, right of self-defense, right of life, things like that, you know. But for right now, I think what's important is the focus on this edict is not about starting scuffles, but about defending oneself and one's family if attacked. The first edict was about an annihilation of an entire people group. It was about genocide. This edict is enabling and empowering those people against whom the first edict was issued to be able to defend themselves, to be able to protect themselves. So one edict devalues life. The other one values it such that if someone seeks to do them harm, they have the right to rise up and protect their lives and protect their family. And notice the wording, only if they are attacked. They have the right to defend themselves, nothing more. Notice the third thing. There's strength in numbers. This edict allows them to band together. So, in other words, there's a strength that's found in numbers. And so this is to be done in the context of community. It's not everyone for himself, every family for themselves. This is the Jews standing together in solidarity and defending themselves together from those who would seek to eradicate them and do them harm. And this serves as a kind of deterrent against the first edict, right? So if it's like, I just go up to a Jewish home and I can get my buddies together and we can kill that Jewish family and we can take all their property and divide it up between the three of us, that might seem a lot more tenable than, oh man, they gathered together. There's 300 of them together in this city, and they've barricaded themselves in their synagogue. And the men are standing there with pickaxes and knives and swords and ready to start slaying us down. And there's a door going in, so there's the fatal funnel. And who wants to be the first? No, not me. I'm not going in there. You go first. No, I'm not going first. Right? It's a deterrent. It actually prevents the first edict from really being effective because all of a sudden they're like, maybe my life is not worth some land and livestock. Maybe this is not such a good idea after all. And just as a side note, that's true of us too in our spiritual battles. Like the Lone Ranger Christian mentality. There's strength from surrounding yourselves with others in the fight of faith. There's strength in barricading yourselves against the attack of the enemies by banding together with friends to help that fight. And so this edict is issued in Susa and sent out to all 127 provinces. Now, last point is notice the response of the Jews. They celebrate in verses 15 to 17. Now, keep in mind the whole story. At the end of chapter 3 and the beginning of chapter 4, following the first edict, the Jews mourned and fasted, and Susa was thrown into confusion. At the end of chapter 8, they are filled with gladness, and they are celebrating. Look at verses 15 through 17. Then Mordecai left the king's presence wearing the royal robe of blue and white, and a great crown of gold, and an outer cloak of fine linen and purple. And the people of Susa celebrated the new decree. The Jews were filled with joy and gladness and were honored everywhere. In every province and city, wherever the king's decree arrived, the Jews rejoiced and had a great celebration and declared a public festival and holiday. And many of the people of the land became Jews themselves, for they feared what the Jews might do to them. A couple things. Now, maybe this is because I'm a nerd. We've already established that. But what came into my head, the picture that came into my head is Return of the Jedi, right? The second Death Star is destroyed, and the Ewoks are like having this party. I mean, it's like bonfires everywhere. There's dancing, they're, high-fiving and hugging, and everybody's reading, hey, this is wonderful, yay. And in the background is the Death Star's particles burning up in the atmosphere. And it's like, this is like a celebration because there's actually a prospect of disaster being averted. At the first edict, Mordecai was mourning in sackcloth and ashes. And at the second edict, he leaves the king's presence dressed in fine robes and a crown and fine linens. He had a reason to change his clothes. Remember when he wouldn't change his clothes? When Esther sent them to him? He had a reason to change his clothes. There was an occasion for mourning in the first one, and now there is an occasion for celebration in the second one. He couldn't go into the king's presence with the first one. Now he's leaving the king's presence with the second one as the chief advisor to the king. And this is the case with all of the Jews. They hear of the edict and celebration breaks out. They were looked at before as enemies who would be killed. Now they are honored. They're filled with joy and gladness. Who brings about changes like this? Only God can bring about changes like this. Look at the last verse. Many in the countryside became Jews out of fear of the Jewish people and what might be done to them. That's an odd sentence. Like, most of us would be like, that's not a good reason to join a synagogue. But what if it is that maybe this is the beginning of their conversion story? Maybe because they were afraid of the Jews and became Jews themselves and adopted that faith out of paganism, that through process of going to synagogue, they were exposed to the one true God. And then subsequently had a genuine conversion and really were included as part of God's people. Right? Fear of death is not a good enough reason to become part of God's people. There has to be a love of God. There has to be something that changes inside of us. Maybe this was the beginning of their story changing. Maybe this was the upward tick of their story arc. All because of an edict that was issued by a Jew that was brought into power by God's providence. There's a few things I think we can take from this and learn from this. First of all, pragmatism is not a Christian virtue. Pragmatism just simply says the ends justify the means. The ends justify the means. That's pragmatism. And Esther had concealed her identity as a Jew and lived in a pagan culture in ways that demanded that she compromise her distinctiveness in certain ways. And all of that was done because presumably she thought the compromises would be worth it. What's interesting is that when she comes clean and identifies with God's people fully and telling the king that she's a Jew, that Mordecai is her father, it doesn't seem to bother him. Pragmatism always leads to theological compromise and a willingness to lay aside what makes us distinctive in Christianity in order to achieve an intended goal or end. So pragmatism starts with the end that we want and then reverse engineers how we get there. And do you see how doing that leads to compromise? Let me give you an example. You want a promotion, but you're late on a project, and that might compromise the promotion. So you can own up to it, or you can fudge some information and get it in on time. I mean, they probably won't notice if you fudge the information. It's non-essential information. Nobody looks at it anyway. It's just kind of buried in there. They wanted it. It's a check-the-box thing. It doesn't matter whether it's accurate or not. It just matters that it's in there. And so they're not going to notice, and it's not going to make a big difference for the company, and it's not going to put anything off of me because they won't catch it and they won't notice. And it's not really critical information, and I know it's dishonest, but if I get the promotion, then I'm in a position to share Christ more. See how that works? The starting point for a Christian is not the desired aim, but what God says. We start with fidelity to God and then work from there. What would honor God? What would please God? What has he explicitly said? And then we move forward, starting with those principles and commands, and let God work out the outcome, because the end for us is Christ-likeness and honoring God. In other words, the means matter, and God handles the ends. That should be the aim of our lives. And the way that we get there matters. You might get the promotion, but what does it gain? What does it profit you if you get a promotion and dishonor God in the process? And we've already seen these things always end up catching up with us, either in this life or the next. And let me ask this, when we fall into pragmatism, so perhaps you find yourself like, maybe I've fallen into some pragmatism and compromise. What do I do? Well, the good news of the gospel is there's always a way out. And the way out is not just like muscle up and be better. The way out is feel godly sorrow that leads to repentance and then exercise repentance. And it's more than just feeling sorry. It's godly grief over sin accompanied by seeking forgiveness and changing direction. It's confessing sin and asking forgiveness and seeking God's grace to live differently. And we might not have assurance of forgiveness from men, but we certainly do have assurance of forgiveness from God. So if you found yourself in compromise, if you found yourself in some sort of pragmatic approach to life or family or work or relationships or whatever, the answer is don't just try to do better. The answer is not just like ignore it and bottle it down and just like start from zero on your own. The answer is feel the grief and sorrow and let that drive you to God in repentance, knowing that he forgives and that he receives our appeals because Christ has died for our pragmatic approaches to life. Christ has died for our compromises. And then that allows us to live new with new confidence and new joy, and it makes God's redemptive power all the more clear because he continues to work in our lives in spite of our sin. And we've seen that in this chapter of Esther. I mean, Esther fully identifies with God's people in this case, no matter what, and God uses it. But we also see that God positioned her to be able to be used in the midst of her compromise. So there's always a way out. This Esther is not a license to just compromise because the ends justify the means. Esther is a cautionary tale about what compromise gets you and how God continues to work in the midst of our compromise. And it's calling us to fully identify with God and his people, not hide it and try to do the pragmatic thing. Second application, your story. Now, remember when that lengthy intro about stories and story arcs that some of you were like, all right, let's move on. This is enough. Others of you were like, yeah, I get that. I think that at this point in Esther, it's worth pointing out that the same is true of your story. Your story has an arc. And your story contributes to the greater story of God's redemptive plan. That arc includes an ebb and flow of tension and resolution. There are high moments and low moments. There's points of failure. There's points of resolution. And your story, if you're a Christian, is woven into the grand story arc of God's redemption. And so your story matters. Your story is part of God's story, and your story has an end. But you know the outcome. If you've trusted in Christ, you know the outcome of your story. You know how your story ends. You don't necessarily know what takes you out. But you know that once you're taken out, then the end begins. And the end of your, I can't remember who it was. I think it was, of course, yes, there was. Each story was better than all of the previous stories in the last battle. That's what we have to look forward to. So live your story well. Recognize that your story is contributing to God's story, but also recognize that your story has an arc. It has ebbs and flows. It has high points and low points. Recognize that your story has a hero behind you, and you are maybe a supporting hero if you're a Christian. You're not the hero. Recognize that there are enemies, but behind every one of the enemies in your story is a bigger enemy. Recognize that there are dilemmas, but underneath each of those dilemmas is the greater dilemma of sin. You battle an enemy as a supporting character, but the hero has already won, and we are waiting for the end of our story where there is resolution and we spend eternity filled with joy. The hero has dealt the final blow to the enemy and given the supporting characters a task to play as that victory plays out. So live your story well. Esther and Mordecai had a heck of a story up to this point. You really think you don't? Live your story well. Number 3, we need to plead before the king. Esther was concerned for the salvation of her people, and that led her to plead before the king. In other words, she didn't take the take of, well, I'm good. Good luck to them. She was good, and now she goes and brings her case to the king. I think there's a lesson in this. It seems that we could do a lot more with pleading before the king concerning the calamity that awaits our unconverted friends and family when they die. If it is appointed man wants to die and then comes judgment, and if the only way to escape judgment is the cross of Christ and faith in the substitutionary death and resurrection of Jesus, then that is of the utmost import. When was the last time you pleaded before the king for your lost friends and family? When was the last time you approached the throne of grace on behalf of your family members and friends? When was the last time that you were gripped by the impending judgment of God that they will endure unless they repent and believe? Are you content that you're saved? And then say, well, good luck. Or are you willing to approach the throne of grace and plead their case on behalf of them, that God would intervene and do something in their lives? And all of this is because we forget what we have been saved from and saved to, right? We have been saved from the wrath of God, and we've been saved to relationship with God. So it's not just that he's not mad at us anymore, it's that he adopts us as children. And that's the need that every person in our lives that is not a Christian has. The wrath of God is upon them because of their sin, and they need not only that wrath taken away, but they need a father that loves them and cares for them perfectly. They need to be brought into the family of God. Why is it that we become complacent when others face the same reality and are either unaware or in denial? It's almost like saying, I got out of the burning building and didn't go up to the firefighter and ask him to save my friend that was in there. I'm convinced we need to plead before the king more, because that is the most effective thing you can do to impact eternity for those you love. And the close second is to open your mouths and share the gospel with them and plead to them to repent and believe. One final point of application. There are times and seasons when we should mourn, and mourning is proper and appropriate. But I fear that we are rarely on the lookout for reasons to celebrate. And I fear, in fact, we do a rather poor job of celebrating. So I've had the opportunity to attend both a wedding and a funeral in different cultures. The funeral was in Romania, and it was interesting because it was an all-day affair and it ended in a feast. It's really weird. The funeral was, it ended in a celebration, all right? And what's interesting is that the woman who died was a Christian, and then there was a fantastic 5-course meal that she arranged at her own expense because she wanted everyone to end the day in celebrating that she was with her Lord. 5-course meal. I thought, Romania is a really poor country, and we were here for this thing, and I thought the first course was the only course. I was like, ooh, gonna be a lean day today. They kept on bringing more, and kept on bringing more, and kept on bringing more. And then it took forever to eat this meal, because in the midst of these different courses, the Christians in the room would burst out into song and sing. And my interpreter would tell me the words that they were singing. And they were songs of joyfulness and thankfulness and celebration of what Christ had done. Now, contrast that with American funerals. They're dull, dreary affairs. There's little celebration. Now, I'm not saying we don't mourn the loss of people, right? But I'm saying, do we just leave it there? For a Christian especially, my goodness. To be absent from the body is to be present with the Lord. Maybe we need to read our Bibles and actually apply our theology a little bit more. What about a wedding? This wedding ceremony was a Croatian wedding, and it lasted all day, and there was food and drink and laughter and dancing until the late night, and everybody stayed. Nobody had to be coerced into staying. Amazing food, amazing drink, amazing conversation. We need to learn to feast and celebrate God's activities in our lives. We need to learn to be intentional in enjoying God's good gifts of food and drink and fellowship as we gather together and enjoy them as a means of celebrating what God has done. The Jews, when they heard about this edict, they celebrated. When was the last time you celebrated? What was that celebration like? We can celebrate what God has done, what he is doing, what he will do. Do you remember when the prodigal son returned? The prodigal son returned and the father said, kill the fatted calf. Let us celebrate. My son was dead and now he has returned. And the older brother's like, you never killed a fatted cow for me. Me. We celebrate. God shows us celebration all throughout Scripture. Jesus performed his first miracle at a wedding feast. And the first miracle was turning water into wine because they ran out. They were having a good time. They were celebrating God's grace in marriage. And the first miracle that Jesus did was at a feast, at a celebration. In Luke 14, he uses the feast to illustrate how God gives and we cannot repay him. And the great culmination of God's redemptive story is all of us sitting together at the wedding feast of the Lamb, where we celebrate Christ together as his people. We need to learn to celebrate. Celebrate weddings. Celebrate funerals of believers. Celebrate baptisms. Celebrate anniversaries. Celebrate birthdays. Celebrate a young man coming of age. Celebrate a young woman coming of age. Celebrate the job promotion. Celebrate getting the job. Celebrate the fact that your friends are able to gather together in a warm home in negative 40 degrees. Find a reason to celebrate God's goodness. And don't just do it for the sake of eating a good meal and drinking a good glass of wine and being around good friends. Do it for the sake of enjoying God and through enjoying his gifts. Celebrate the Lord's Day. Celebrate being together on the weekend. There's a family that I know of. They have a family celebration dinner every Saturday because they're celebrating that we get to go and worship God tomorrow and enjoy his day. Find a reason to celebrate. Go all out. Be filled with gladness and joy that comes from knowing the Lord, seeing what he is doing, and be thankful for his care and provision, and invite others into that. The second edict came, and the people of God celebrated. We need to remember how to celebrate. Let's pray.